The Eastern Front was burning. From the frozen ruins of Stalingrad to the endless plains of Ukraine, the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had become a monster, devouring millions. Germany had lost its invincibility. For the first time, the Red Army had pushed the Wehrmacht back. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. He wanted one last blow, a strike so powerful it would crush the Soviets once and for all. That strike would be Kursk. The plan was called Operation Citadel. It was simple in theory, terrifying in scale. Two massive German armies would attack the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet front lines, from north and south, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops inside a deadly steel ring. Once crushed, the path to Moscow would reopen. At least that's what Hitler believed. But the Soviets were ready. They knew what was coming. Months before the first German tank even moved, Soviet intelligence had uncovered the entire plan. And instead of retreating, they turned Kursk into a fortress. Thousands of trenches were dug, millions of mines were laid, and an army of more than 1 million men prepared to meet the Nazi war machine head-on. It would be the largest armored battle the world had ever seen. Inside his Wolf's Lair headquarters, Hitler gathered his generals. Maps stretched across the table, covered in arrows and red circles. The Führer's finger pointed straight at Kursk. "Here," he said, "we will strike here, and with this blow, we will end the Russian threat forever." But many of his commanders weren't convinced. Field Marshal von Manstein warned him, "My Führer, the Soviets know too much. They are waiting for us." Hitler didn't listen. His pride demanded a victory, and he believed his new weapon would guarantee it. The Tiger tank. The Tiger was a monster of steel, heavy armor, a powerful 88mm gun, and a reputation that made Allied soldiers tremble. It could destroy a Soviet T-34 from over a mile away. Hitler saw it as his miracle weapon, the key to restoring German supremacy. Factories worked day and night to produce them. Tank crews trained relentlessly, their boots sinking in mud, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the Red Army waited. The Germans called it the decisive battle. The Soviets called it the meat grinder. History would remember it as the Battle of Kursk, July 5th, 1943. Before dawn, the night sky lit up with thunder. Artillery fire rolled across the plains like an earthquake. The German attack had begun. Thousands of tanks, half-tracks, and guns moved forward in a wall of fire. Engines roared, tracks clattered, and smoke swallowed the fields. The greatest clash of steel in human history was underway. And deep in the Soviet lines, men waited in silence, hands shaking, hearts pounding, ready to face the storm. Dawn broke over the Russian steppe, but the sun was hidden behind smoke. The earth trembled as German tanks rolled forward, their treads grinding through the soil like the jaws of a beast. From the northern sector, General Model's 9th Army advanced. From the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army pushed upward. Between them, the Soviet defenses stretched for miles. The Germans were confident. They had the best tanks in the world, Tigers and Panthers, the new steel predators of the battlefield. Their soldiers were experienced, veterans of countless campaigns. But this time, they were marching into hell. The Soviets had prepared for this moment for months. Entire villages were turned into defensive fortresses. Mines covered the fields so thickly that even the grass seemed deadly. Every road, every hill, every patch of forest was mapped, measured, and ready to kill. Behind the front line, artillery batteries waited silently. When the German tanks came into range, the steppe exploded. Shells rained from the sky. Smoke and fire swallowed the armored columns. Men shouted orders that vanished in the thunder of explosions. And yet, the Germans kept coming. Inside a Tiger tank, Sergeant Karl Weber gripped the controls. He couldn't see more than a few meters through the smoke, but his training kept him calm. "Target ahead, 800 meters, shouted his gunner. Karl steadied the turret. A flash, a Soviet T-34 erupted in flames. The Tiger's gun roared again and again, each shot shaking the ground like a hammer from the gods. But for every Soviet tank destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear. They came in waves, fearless, relentless. The radio crackled. "Our flank is hit. Mines ahead. We're stuck." Static. Silence. The German offensive slowed. Every inch of ground was paid for with blood. Mud, smoke, and shattered steel covered the plains of Kursk. Then came the counterfire. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed their fury, a howling storm of fire that painted the sky red. Soldiers on both sides described it as the sound of the world ending. Miles behind the front, Soviet General Rokossovsky watched the chaos unfold through binoculars. He knew the Germans would break through the first lines. That was part of the plan. Each defensive belt was designed to exhaust the enemy, to drain their strength before the real counterattack. "Let them come," he said calmly. "We will bury them at Kursk." Meanwhile, in the south, General Hoth's armored spearhead was gaining ground. Led by the elite SS divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, they advanced like a black tide, unstoppable, disciplined, and deadly. The air above them was alive with dogfights. German Messerschmitts clashed with Soviet Yak fighters, twisting and diving through clouds of smoke. Pilots didn't have time to think, only to react. A second too slow meant death. Parachutes opened like white flowers against the burning sky. On the ground, the scale of destruction was beyond imagination. Entire forests were flattened by tank tracks. The wounded screamed for medics who would never come. And above it all, the roar of engines drowned out prayers and orders alike. By nightfall, both armies were locked in a deadly stalemate. The Germans had advanced, but not far enough. The Soviets had taken massive losses, but still held the line. The first day of Kursk was over, and the world had already changed. July 7th, 1943. The second dawn over Kursk was darker than the first. Smoke still hung low over the fields, the stench of burning oil and blood thick in the morning air. Across the front, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. Every mile had been fought for tooth and nail. Thousands of tanks lay crippled, some burning, some silent. Their crews, still inside, turned to ash. But Hitler demanded victory. He ordered his generals to press on, no matter the cost. At dawn, the Tiger and Panther formations regrouped. Engines growled. Men who hadn't slept in 2 days tightened their helmets and loaded shells. They were exhausted, but orders were orders. The Soviets were ready. Their lines weren't breaking. They were shifting. Each time the Germans punched through, a new wave of defenders appeared like ghosts rising from the smoke. Trenches that had seemed abandoned suddenly erupted with machine gun fire. Anti-tank rifles cracked in the distance, and overhead, the low drone of Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik planes filled the sky. The Germans called them the Black Death. Inside one of those planes, pilot Ivan Petrov gripped his stick tight. He'd already flown 6 sorties that morning, each one diving low over German armor. Now, as he lined up his next target, the landscape below looked like another planet, blackened earth, twisted steel, and fire everywhere. "For the motherland," he whispered and pressed the trigger. Rockets streaked downward, hitting a German half-track dead-on. The explosion sent shrapnel slicing through the air. Ivan pulled up, his cockpit shaking from the blast. Below, Soviet troops cheered. For the first time since the battle began, they felt hope. In the German lines, hope was fading fast. Fuel was running low, ammunition was being rationed, and the new Panther tanks, Hitler's pride, were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Out of 200 Panthers sent into battle, more than half had already been lost. Not to enemy fire, but to engine fires, transmission failures, and sheer mechanical exhaustion. The Tiger was powerful, but slow, heavy, and thirsty. It could dominate open ground, but Kursk wasn't open ground anymore. It was a maze of craters, trenches, and wrecks. The battlefield had become a graveyard of steel. Meanwhile, deep in Moscow, Stalin was watching every report that came from the front. He had ordered that Kursk must hold, no retreat, no surrender. Every soldier knew what that meant. Behind the lines, NKVD officers stood ready, watching the men fight. Anyone who retreated without orders would be shot. It was brutal, but it worked. The Red Army stood firm. They fought with the desperation of a people who had already seen their homes burned, their families killed, their cities destroyed. They weren't fighting for conquest. They were fighting for survival. By July 9th, the Germans had advanced only a few kilometers. The Soviet defenses seemed endless. Every time the Wehrmacht thought it had broken through, a new line appeared. The toll was devastating. Entire divisions were cut to pieces. In the northern sector, Model's Ninth Army was stuck in a swamp of mines and artillery fire. In the south, Hoth's panzers were still pushing, but slower, weaker, bloodier with each passing hour. And then came the message that changed everything. On July 10th, Soviet intelligence confirmed a massive counteroffensive forming to the north. The Germans didn't know it yet, but the Red Army was about to unleash its own storm. The commander of the Central Front, Rokossovsky, stood in his bunker surrounded by maps, his hands steady as he issued the order. "Comrades," he said, "the time has come. Let's turn Kursk into their grave." That night, under the cover of darkness, Soviet tank divisions began to move. Engines rumbled softly, tracks grinding over the soil soaked with oil and blood. By dawn, tens of thousands of men and machines were ready to strike back. The hunters were about to become the hunted. July 12th, 1943. The world held its breath. At dawn, the plains near the small village of Prokhorovka were covered in a thick mist. Beneath that fog waited two of the greatest armored forces ever assembled. On one side, the German 2 SS Panzer Corps, elite soldiers with their Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs ready to deliver the killing blow. On the other, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, an army of steel and fire, more than 800 tanks ready to charge headfirst into the storm. The air was still, engines idled, men checked their guns one last time, then the order came. Forward, for the motherland, and hell broke loose. The sound of 1,000 engines roared like thunder. The Soviet tanks surged forward in massive waves, crashing through the fog and smoke like a tidal wave of iron. The ground shook beneath them. Ahead, German gunners scrambled to adjust their sights. Through the haze, black shapes appeared. Dozens, then hundreds of them. "Fein Panzer! Hundreds of them!" someone shouted. Then the first shells were fired. Explosions tore through the fields. Tanks erupted in fireballs. Steel collided with steel. Machine guns screamed, and the peaceful fields of Prokhorovka turned into a furnace of death. Inside his Tiger tank, German commander Michael Wittmann, one of the most feared tank aces in the war, watched the chaos unfold. His radio buzzed with overlapping voices. Panic, shouting, orders drowned in static. "They're charging straight at us!" He lined up his sights, fired, and a Soviet T-34 burst into flames. Then another. But for every one destroyed, 5 more came forward. The Soviet tactic was simple and brutal. Get as close as possible, smash into the German lines, and fight at point-blank range where the Tigers' long-range advantage meant nothing. General Rotmistrov watched from a command post on a nearby hill. All he could see was smoke, endless black smoke. He couldn't tell who was winning. He couldn't even see where the front line was anymore. It was chaos, pure chaos. But he knew one thing. The Germans had been stopped. On the ground, Soviet tank commander Sergeant Nikolai Sokolov felt his T-34 shudder under fire. A shell hit the side, tearing off part of the armor. The heat inside was unbearable. His gunner shouted, "They're everywhere!" Sokolov gritted his teeth. Then, "We fight everywhere!" He slammed the throttle forward. His tank rammed into a German panzer, the collision throwing sparks and fire into the air. At that moment, the battlefield wasn't strategy, it was survival. The sky above was filled with planes. German Stukas dove in screaming, their sirens wailing like demons. Soviet Yak fighters rose to meet them, dogfighting above the burning fields. Explosions shook the air, flames reached higher than the trees, and the sound was deafening. Men said later that it wasn't a battle, it was the sound of the world ending. By noon, the fields around Prokhorovka were littered with burning wrecks. Tank turrets lay scattered like giant helmets. Bodies, German and Soviet, covered the scorched earth. Neither side could claim victory. Both had been bled dry. But strategically, it was the Germans who broke first. Their advance had stopped. Their fuel was nearly gone. Their losses were irreplaceable. For the first time, the once invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped dead in its tracks by the Red Army. That evening, Rotmistrov reported to Stalin by radio. His voice was tired, hoarse, but steady. "Comrade Stalin, the enemy has been halted. Prokhorovka is ours." There was silence for a moment, then Stalin replied, "Good. Now, push them back." The Battle of Prokhorovka had lasted just 1 day, but it changed everything. The Germans would never again launch a large-scale offensive in the east. Their dream of crushing the Soviet Union died in the fields of Kursk. From that moment on, Hitler's armies were in retreat, step by step, town by town, until the red flag would one day rise over Berlin. The smoke over Kursk lingered for days. The sky itself seemed to mourn. Everywhere the eye could see, wrecked tanks, burnt-out trucks, shattered helmets, and the twisted remains of men and machines. The largest tank battle in history was over. But the echoes of its fury would last forever. When the dust settled, the Soviets counted their dead, tens of thousands of soldiers. Entire divisions had been wiped out, but they had held the line. And that meant one thing: Germany had failed. For Hitler, it was the beginning of the end. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler listened in silence as reports came in. His generals spoke cautiously: losses, fuel shortages, broken supply lines. Finally, Field Marshal Manstein spoke: "My Führer, the offensive has failed. Kursk cannot be taken." Hitler's face turned pale. His hands trembled with anger. He slammed his fist on the table. "No, it's impossible. We had the best tanks, the best soldiers." But deep down, he knew the truth. The Tiger and Panther tanks had proven powerful, but they couldn't win a war alone. Germany's strength was bleeding out, and the Soviet Union was only growing stronger. In Moscow, the news was met with celebration. For the first time, Stalin smiled in public. He called it a turning point of the Great Patriotic War. Posters appeared across the Soviet Union, from Kursk to Berlin. Factories worked around the clock. For every tank the Germans lost, the Soviets built 3 more. For every soldier who fell, another stepped forward. The Red Army had learned, adapted, evolved. On the front, Soviet troops began to push westward. Cities like Orel and Belgorod were liberated within weeks. Villagers cheered as columns of T-34 tanks rolled past their shattered homes, red flags waving proudly in the summer wind. The soldiers were exhausted, covered in mud and soot, but they were alive, and they were advancing. The Germans, meanwhile, were in chaos. Their morale was broken. They had lost their aura of invincibility. Men who once believed they were fighting for a 1,000-year Reich now whispered of defeat. Commanders struggled to hold their lines. Supplies ran thin. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was being pushed from the skies by swarms of Soviet fighters. Every day, the front moved west, closer and closer to Germany itself. By late summer 1943, it was clear. The Eastern Front belonged to the Soviets. Hitler's dream of crushing the Red Army had died at Kursk. And from that moment, his war became one of desperation, defense, retreat, and denial. The mighty Wehrmacht, once unstoppable across Europe, was now fighting just to survive. Veterans who had fought at Kursk would remember it for the rest of their lives. The endless noise, the blinding fire, the smell of burning metal. They said it changed them forever, that after Kursk, they no longer feared death because they had already seen hell. Years later, historians would call the Battle of Kursk the true turning point of World War II. It wasn't just a Soviet victory. It was the moment the tide of history turned. From that day forward, the Red Army would push relentlessly through the ruins of Ukraine, across Poland, and all the way to the heart of Berlin. And in 1945, when the red flag finally rose above the Reichstag, many of those who stood beneath it had once fought in the fields of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk was not just a clash of tanks, it was a clash of wills. Steel versus steel, faith versus fear. And in that inferno, it was the human spirit that proved unbreakable. Kursk was the day the hunter became the hunted. The day the world learned that even the strongest machine of war can be defeated by courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Long after the guns fell silent, the fields of Kursk still whispered stories, not from generals or historians, but from the men who were there, those who fought, those who bled, those who somehow walked away from the inferno. Private Alexei Morozov, a young Soviet soldier, only 19 years old. He would later write in his diary, "When the battle began, I thought the sky itself was falling. The ground shook, the air burned. The noise never stopped. We were told to hold the line, so we did. I saw men catch fire and keep firing their rifles. I saw tanks melt into the earth, and I saw courage like I'd never seen before." He was one of only 6 survivors from his company. Sergeant Karl Weber, the German Tiger commander we met before, was captured weeks after the battle. Years later, in a prison camp, he told a Red Cross interviewer, "We thought our tanks were gods. Nothing could touch them. But at Kursk, I learned that machines don't win wars. Men do." The Russians never stopped coming. Even when their tanks were burning, they kept advancing. I still see them when I close my eyes. Another voice came from the skies. Lieutenant Hans Bauer, a German pilot who flew over Prokhorovka, described what he saw below. From the air, the battlefield looked alive. Tanks moved like insects. Fire flashed from everywhere. I couldn't tell friend from foe. The smoke was so thick I thought I'd crash into it. I saw a T-34 ram into a Tiger. Both exploded together. There were no victors in that place, only survivors. And then from the Soviet Air Force, Captain Ivan Petrov, the Sturmovik pilot, "We were told to strike the German tanks at dawn. I remember the first rocket I fired. It hit a Tiger and burst into flames. But I didn't cheer. I just thought another man is dying down there, and maybe tomorrow it will be me." He flew 17 missions over Kursk. On the 18th, his plane never returned. Many of these men would never be remembered by name. No statues, no medals, no graves, just ashes scattered across the steppe. But their courage, their sacrifice, lives forever in the soil of Kursk. After the battle, local villagers began to return. What they found was not land, but a sea of twisted metal. For months, farmers uncovered shells, helmets, and human remains buried beneath their fields. Children played near wrecked tanks that still smelled of oil and death. Even today, rusted tracks and fragments of steel are still found in the ground. Silent witnesses of the greatest clash of armor the world has ever known. One old farmer who had survived the war said in an interview decades later, "We could still hear the echoes at night. The The ground would remember the footsteps of soldiers. When the wind blew, it sounded like tanks moving again. Kursk became more than just a battle. It became a symbol of endurance, of sacrifice, of how far a nation would go to survive. For the Germans, it marked the end of hope. For the Soviets, it was proof that they could stand against the strongest army in the world and win. And for the soldiers who lived through it, Kursk would never end. They carried it in their minds, in their nightmares, in the scars that never healed. "We survived," one veteran said, "but part of us never left that battlefield." After Kursk, the world changed. The thunder of that battle didn't stop in the fields of Russia, it echoed across all of Europe. For the first time since the war began, Germany was no longer advancing. The unstoppable war machine that had once conquered Poland, France, and half of the Soviet Union was now fighting just to hold the line. And deep inside every German soldier's heart, a new and terrible thought began to grow. We might lose this war. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army seized the momentum. They pressed forward relentlessly, reclaiming cities and villages one by one. Each offensive was faster, stronger, more coordinated. The Soviet military had learned the art of modern warfare, and they were using it with devastating precision. New T-34s rolled out of factories by the thousands. Artillery units operated like clockwork. And the once disorganized Soviet Air Force was now a powerful weapon of destruction, sweeping the skies clear of German planes. In contrast, Germany was breaking apart. Factories were being bombed by the Allies day and night. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Entire divisions were undersupplied, exhausted, and overwhelmed. Even the mighty Tiger tanks were running dry. No fuel, no spare parts, no replacements. Commanders in the field begged Berlin for reinforcements, but there were none left to send. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had pushed the Germans back hundreds of kilometers. Cities like Smolensk, Kharkov, and Kiev were liberated. The front line that had once threatened Moscow was now collapsing westward. And for the first time, the Soviet people could breathe again. In the West, the Allies watched closely. British and American generals knew that Kursk had opened the door. The German army was bleeding out on the Eastern Front, and soon it would be time to strike from the West. The countdown to D-Day had begun. Meanwhile, inside Hitler's bunker, the mood had turned to despair. He stopped listening to his generals. He blamed everyone but himself. He ordered counterattacks that made no sense, throwing away thousands of lives for no gain. Field Marshal Manstein once said, "After Kursk, it was no longer a question of winning, only of delaying the inevitable." The psychological blow was enormous. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered. Soviet propaganda spread like wildfire. Kursk has shown the world the Red Army can not only defend, it can destroy, and they proved it. By 1944, Soviet tanks were crossing into Poland. By early 1945, they were on the doorstep of Berlin. All roads led back to Kursk, the moment when the tide turned, when Germany lost its last chance for victory. Historians still argue about the numbers. Nearly 3 million men, 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft fought in that single campaign. It wasn't just the largest tank battle ever. It was the death of Blitzkrieg. From that moment, the lightning war that had terrified Europe was gone forever. Kursk taught the world a lesson. That courage, preparation, and sacrifice can defeat even the most powerful war machine. The Red Army had not only survived, it had risen stronger than ever before. And from the ashes of those fields, a new momentum began. A march that would not stop until the red flag flew over Hitler's capital. In Berlin, the radio broadcasts still tried to sound confident, but the truth was clear. The Reich was bleeding, and the heart of that wound was Kursk. When the smoke cleared over the fields of Kursk, the silence was unbearable. What had once been farmland and green valleys was now a graveyard of steel and ash. Everywhere you looked, tanks lay scattered, some burned to the ground, others half buried in mud, still smoking from the battle that had ended days before. The stench of fuel, gunpowder, and death hung in the air. Flies gathered over the bodies of men who had once been soldiers, now indistinguishable, friend or foe. The earth itself seemed wounded, and those who survived would never forget it. For the Soviet soldiers, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, like relief mixed with grief. Many had fought for days without sleep. Some hadn't eaten in a week. Their uniforms were torn, faces blackened with soot and dust, eyes hollow from what they'd seen. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The numbers were staggering. The Soviet Union lost more than 250,000 men in the Battle of Kursk. Germany lost around 200,000. Thousands of tanks, planes, and vehicles were destroyed. Entire divisions ceased to exist. And yet, despite the losses, the Soviets had proven something the world had doubted. They could not be broken. In the small villages around Kursk, life was shattered. Houses were burned, crops destroyed, families torn apart. Old women wandered through the ruins looking for their sons. Children searched the battlefields for scraps of food. Fathers buried their boys in makeshift graves beside the roads. The war didn't end for them. It had just left its mark forever. One Soviet nurse, Nina Petrovna, wrote in her diary, "We saved who we could. The rest, we covered with their jackets and moved on. I don't know how many faces I saw that day, but I remember everyone." Her words captured what history often forgets, that behind every victory, there's 1,000 silent sacrifices. Even the German soldiers who survived felt it. They were no longer fighting for glory or conquest. They were fighting to stay alive. Many realized in those burning fields that the war they once believed in had already been lost. Letters home became shorter. Talk of victory disappeared. What replaced it was fear, regret, and longing for peace. In one captured German diary, a tank commander wrote, "The earth burns beneath us. Every day we lose more men. The Soviets fight like shadows, endless, fearless. I think God has left us." It's a haunting confession, one that echoed the despair spreading through the entire Wehrmacht. But among the ruins, there were also stories of extraordinary humanity. A Soviet soldier shared his rations with a wounded German POW. A nurse used the last of her bandages on an enemy pilot. Moments like these, rare and fleeting, reminded everyone that beneath the uniforms, they were all just people. The victory at Kursk marked the beginning of hope for the Allies, but it also marked the beginning of mourning for millions. Every Soviet mother who had sent her son to war knew the truth, that victory had come, but not without unbearable loss. When Stalin spoke to the nation after the battle, his tone was not triumphant, but solemn. "Comrades," he said, "the fields of Kursk are soaked with the blood of heroes. Their sacrifice has bought us freedom. We will honor them, not with words, but with victory." And the people believed him. They had to, because there was no going back, only forward toward Berlin. As the Red Army buried their dead, new recruits arrived at the front, younger faces, determined eyes, boys who had grown up too fast, ready to take the place of those who had fallen. The cycle of war continued, endless, merciless, unstoppable. But from Kursk onward, the world knew the tide had turned. And though the victory had cost a river of blood, it was a price the Soviet people were willing to pay. Because in that terrible summer of 1943, they didn't just win a battle. They proved that even under fire, even surrounded by death, a nation's spirit can rise from the ashes and never fall again. The road to Berlin began on the smoking fields of Kursk. What started as a desperate defense became an unstoppable advance. The Red Army had learned, adapted, and evolved. Now they were coming for revenge. By late 1943, the Soviet front stretched across thousands of kilometers. Everywhere, red banners rose where the swastika once flew. Kharkov, Smolensk, Kiev. One by one, the cities that had suffered under German occupation were liberated. Each victory was paid for with blood, but it was also fuel for the fire that burned inside every Soviet soldier. They had seen their homeland ravaged, their families killed, their homes turned to ashes. And now they were taking it all back. The German High Command tried everything to slow the advance. They built fortifications, laid endless minefields, and positioned their tanks in defensive lines. But the Soviets had become masters of coordination. Their offensives rolled forward like thunder. Artillery first, then the tanks, then the infantry, then the Air Force sweeping overhead like hawks. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was precision, cold, relentless precision. By early 1944, Operation Bagration was launched, one of the largest and most successful offensives in human history. In just a few weeks, the Red Army destroyed Army Group Center, the heart of the German Eastern Defense. Entire divisions vanished. German generals called it the greatest defeat in German military history. In Berlin, Hitler was furious. He screamed at his generals, accused them of betrayal, and refused to believe the truth, that his empire was collapsing from the inside. As Soviet troops pushed westward, they crossed into lands that had once been Poland, then into the Balkans, then toward East Prussia itself, German soil. The closer they came to Berlin, the fiercer the resistance became. Every village, every river, every bridge was defended to the last man. But the Red Army had momentum, numbers, and determination. They couldn't be stopped. In one Soviet division, a captain named Ivan Chernyakov told his men before an assault, Remember what they did to our homes. Remember the mothers they killed, the children they burned. Now we fight, not for Stalin, not for medals, we fight for them. And when the whistle blew, they charged through bullets, through fire, through hell itself. By late 1944, the Red Army stood just a few hundred kilometers from Berlin. They had liberated Minsk, Warsaw, and Budapest. The Germans were fighting on two fronts now, the Soviets from the east and the Americans and British from the west. The walls were closing in, but every step toward Berlin revealed more horror. In village after village, Soviet troops found the remnants of concentration camps. They found children with numbers tattooed on their arms. They found survivors, weak, starving, broken. And with every camp they liberated, their hatred grew deeper. There was no longer any mercy in their march. For the soldiers of the Red Army, Berlin wasn't just a military target. It was justice. Winter of 1944 turned Europe into a frozen wasteland. Snow covered the battlefields, but even the bitter cold couldn't stop the Red advance. Artillery thundered day and night. Trains loaded with tanks and troops rolled toward the front without rest. Factories in the Ural Mountains worked 24 hours a day, pumping out weapons, ammunition, and supplies. It was as if the entire Soviet Union had one heartbeat, and it was beating for Berlin. By April 1945, the Red Army had surrounded the city. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, was under siege. More than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were ready for the final assault. The Germans had maybe 800,000, many of them old men and teenage boys, armed with rifles and blind faith. The battle for Berlin was about to begin, and it would be the bloodiest chapter of them all. But standing before the ruins of the Reich, one thing was already certain. The war that had begun in fire would end in fire. And when it did, the shadow that had darkened the world for 6 long years would finally be gone. Berlin, April 1945. The once proud capital of Hitler's Reich was now a city of ruins. The streets were lined with rubble, the sky black with smoke, and the constant thunder of artillery echoed from every direction. The Red Army was at the gates. After 4 years of relentless fighting, the soldiers who had defended Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk now stood ready to deliver the final blow. In his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler still clung to delusions of victory. He issued orders to divisions that no longer existed. He demanded counterattacks from units that were already dead. Around him, Berlin was collapsing. The once loyal generals whispered about surrender. Civilians dug trenches in the streets, children carried rifles, and the sound of Soviet artillery grew closer with every hour. The city had become a fortress of despair. At dawn on April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched its final offensive. The Battle of Berlin had begun. The earth shook as more than 40,000 artillery guns opened fire. The bombardment lasted for hours, a storm of steel that turned the outskirts of Berlin into hell itself. When the guns finally fell silent, the tanks rolled in. Thousands of T-34s and heavy IS-2s pushed forward, their tracks crushing the remains of what had once been Germany's greatest city. The Germans fought with everything they had. From street to street, from building to building, they resisted with desperate courage. SS units made their last stand inside government buildings. Civilians, terrified but defiant, fired from windows and rooftops. Every bridge, every square, every subway tunnel became a battleground. But the Soviets came in waves, unstoppable, unyielding. Among the Soviet troops was Sergeant Alexei Volkov, a veteran of Stalingrad. As his unit moved through the burning city, he told his men, "We've come too far to stop now. This ends here. For everyone we lost, for everything they destroyed." They advanced through the smoke under sniper fire, their boots slipping on the ashes of a fallen empire. By April 28th, Soviet forces had reached the Reichstag, the parliament building, symbol of Nazi power. The Germans inside fought to the last bullet. For 2 days, the Soviets battled room by room, floor by floor, until finally on April 30th, they reached the rooftop. And there, under a burning sky, 2 Soviet soldiers, Yegorov and Kantarya, raised the red flag above the Reichstag. That single act became the most iconic image of the war, the moment the world knew the nightmare was ending. That same day, in his bunker below the city, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. When the news spread through the ranks, the fighting didn't stop immediately, but something changed in the air. The rage that had fueled the battle began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and disbelief. On May 2nd, 1945, Berlin officially surrendered. The last German units laid down their weapons. White flags hung from the ruins. Soviet soldiers embraced each other, some crying, some laughing, unable to believe it was finally over. After 4 years, after 27 million Soviet lives, after cities turned to dust and generations wiped out, victory had come. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, was finally won. In the center of Berlin, the Red Army held a moment of silence. No speeches, no music, just silence for the fallen, for the millions who never came home, for the soldiers who had marched from Moscow to Berlin and lived to see the end. When Marshal Zhukov wrote his report to Stalin, he ended it with one line: "The banner of victory flies over Berlin. The war is over." But victory didn't bring peace, not immediately. The world was scarred, divided, broken. A new struggle was beginning, the Cold War. Yet for that brief moment in May 1945, the guns fell silent, and the world breathed again. From the ashes of Berlin, a new world was born. And in the hearts of the soldiers who had survived, one memory would never fade: that it all began in the fields of Kursk, where the tide of war first turned, and where the road to Berlin truly began. The end, the Battle of Kursk, from steel and fire to the fall of Berlin.